Have you ever found yourself kind of stuck? Like you're making choices, aren't really right for you.
Or maybe falling back into those old habits, even though, you really want to change.
Exactly. Whether it's diet or exercise or maybe something like trading, sticking to your plan, that feeling, that inconsistency, it's just so frustrating, isn't it? Like you're sabotaging yourself somehow.
It really is. And, that frustration, often it's a big sign that there's something deeper going on psychologically.
Okay.
So in this deep dive, we're going to look behind the scenes, really, at these deep patterns behind what feels like self-defeating behavior.
And we're drawing on the work of Dr. Brett Steenbarger.
That's right. He's a leading expert in trading psychology, but what's fascinating is how he applies clinical psychotherapy techniques to these very common emotional struggles.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty clear then. We want to unpack Dr. Steenbarger's framework, figure out how to spot these emotional patterns, and, crucially, how to resolve them.
Right. And we'll be focusing on really practical hands-on techniques, things that can genuinely improve performance, not just in trading, actually, but probably in lots of areas of your life.
Sounds great. We've
Yeah.
got insights from his videos, his books. So yeah, let's get started. Let's dig into this core idea first, self-sabotage.
Yeah.
It often feels like a fight inside, right? A part of you versus another part.
Precisely. And Dr. Steenbarger uses a term for this, borrowed from psychiatrist Arnold Goldberg. He calls it the vertical split.
The vertical split. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Think of it like a separate sort of personality inside you, one that exists alongside your regular conscious self, that.
Uh-huh.
But this split-off part holds feelings, impulses that you just don't identify with. It's the source of that feeling like, ugh, that wasn't the real me.
Right, that disconnect. Dr. Steenbarger has some really powerful examples, doesn't he? And interestingly, they're not traders.
No, not at all, which shows how universal this is. He talks about this successful woman, totally committed to her career, her health.
Yeah.
But then she finds herself binging, half a gallon of ice cream
Yeah.
and feels awful afterwards.
Yeah.
Or the happily married guy, great family, good job.
Yeah.
But he has this compulsion to go gamble away money at casinos, feels terrible remorse, but keeps doing it.
Oh.
And there's even this quite disturbing case of a respected professor,
Yeah.
nationally known expert in his field,
Okay.
but he secretly collects child pornography and engages in impersonal sex, living in constant fear of being found out, but he can't stop.
That's really intense,
Yeah.
but it makes the point so clearly, doesn't it? How extreme and compulsive these splits can be, even in people who seem to have it all together.
Exactly. It hammers home that this isn't just about, minor inconsistencies. It can be profound. And it ties directly into trading problems. Well, think about a trader who suddenly just throws their strategy out the window.
Yeah.
Or someone who knows their rules like use a stop loss, but they
Yeah.
just don't. Again and again. That's the vertical split in action.
Okay.
The behavior has specific characteristics. It's under controlled. Like you genuinely don't want to be doing it.
Yeah.
It feels dystonic, which is just a fancy way of saying it feels alien, like that wasn't me.
Right.
It's inconsistent with how you usually are. And it often has this driven, almost compulsive feel, like you have to do it.
And the really frustrating part, the paradox, is that trying harder often backfires.
Yes, that's key. Trying to be the good self, trying to fight that bad self,
Yes.
it actually seems to make it worse.
So the woman diets harder, maybe she binges more, the trader tries to be more disciplined, then trades more impulsively.
Exactly. It creates this awful cycle, guilt, feeling worse about yourself, which often leads right back to the unwanted behavior. And you end up just saying, I'm sabotaging myself.
Is there a reason for this, like in the brain?
Yeah, there's some interesting neuroscience. Very powerful emotional experiences, especially things we'd consider traumatic,
Yeah.
like abuse.
Hmm.
They seem to get processed differently, more in the lower brain structures, the emotional centers.
Okay.
They don't get fully integrated by our frontal lobes. That's our executive center, the rational part. So these experiences can kind of replay in this raw, undigested emotional way. They get triggered easily. And that sets the stage for these splits.
Okay, so that's the underlying split. But how does it actually, play out day to day? How does the self-defeating pattern unfold? Dr. Steenbarger has a kind of roadmap for this, right?
He does. A really clear four-step sequence. It usually goes like this. First, the trigger. Some event, internal or external, kicks off an emotional reaction.
Right.
Second, the shift in state. There's an automatic change. It could be emotional, physical, how you're thinking. It just happens.
Okay.
Third, the unwanted behavior. This is the action you take, often without realizing it, trying to cope with or regulate that unpleasant state you just shifted into.
Ah, okay. So the behavior is trying to fix the feeling.
In a way, yes, a misguided way. And then fourth, inevitably, consequences and guilt, the negative results of the behavior and the bad feelings that follow.
He uses a personal example, doesn't he, about an airport?
Yeah, Las Vegas airport. Really vivid. He describes feeling suddenly suffocated, just withdrawing completely.
What was the trigger?
For him, it was the crowds, the noise, especially the constant dinging of the slot machines. And he connected that back to childhood experiences, feeling kind of stifled by loving but maybe overly involved parents.
Wow. So the airport noise triggered that old feeling.
Exactly. That was the trigger. The shift in state was automatic withdrawal. He went quiet, felt overwhelmed. The unwanted behavior was pulling back from the conversation he was having.
And then the consequences, maybe he caught it that time.
He did, in that instance. He recognized the pattern. But usually that withdrawal might lead to feeling bad or maybe awkwardness with the other person. That's the typical cycle.
Okay, so this is huge. All these problem behaviors, they're actually attempts to cope.
At some level, yes. Misguided attempts at self-regulation. It completely changes how you look at them. Think about that professor example again, the one with the pornography and impersonal sex.
Yeah.
Turns out he grew up in a super authoritarian, repressive family. His behavior, as disturbing as it was actually his unconscious way of trying to regulate these deep feelings of being controlled, of being stifled. It was a twisted way to feel some kind of liberation, to manage an internal state he couldn't bear.
That's really powerful. So if these are attempts to regulate, fighting them head on isn't the answer.
No, that's Dr. Steenbarger's crucial point. Control doesn't come from battling the bad self or trying harder to be good. Fighting just reinforces the split.
So what do you do?
The only real way to change the pattern is to go back to the beginning. You have to reprocess the triggers. Strip them of their emotional power so they don't kick off that whole sequence anymore. If the trigger doesn't fire, you don't need the coping behavior.
Okay, so if willpower isn't the answer, what is? How do we actually start changing these patterns that feel so automatic, so ingrained?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the answer lies in intervening earlier in that sequence,
Yeah.
not trying to force a different behavior at the end, but tackling the trigger or that initial shift in state.
Right.
And this brings us to the first really powerful technique he talks about, exposure-based therapy.
Exposure. Okay.
Now, the key rule here, and it sounds kind of weird at first, is you can only really change an emotional pattern while you are actually in that emotional state.
Wait, so you have to feel the feeling to change it, not just talk about it when you're calm.
Exactly. That's why sometimes just talking about problems doesn't lead to lasting change. You're analyzing it, yes, but you're not experiencing it in a way that allows your brain to actually rewire the response.
Okay, that makes sense. So step one is figuring out your triggers. You mentioned journaling.
Yeah, keeping a log or a diary is super helpful. Notice when those unwanted behaviors pop up. What just happened? What were you thinking or feeling right before?
So in trading, maybe it's seeing the market move against you quickly. That could be a trigger for impulsive selling.
Could be. Or maybe it's seeing a big move you missed, triggering regret, then maybe chasing the market.
Right. Or those under-controlled things like not honoring stops, adding to losers.
Or the over-controlled ones too, like being too scared to enter a trade,
Yeah.
taking tiny profits because you're afraid it'll reverse.
Yeah.
You need to pinpoint what sets you off. Dr. Steenbarger had this trader whose trigger was, surprisingly, boredom.
Boredom. How does boredom lead to bad trading?
Well, digging into it, he came from this super high-achieving family. For him, boredom meant being unproductive. And being unproductive meant being a loser.
Oh, wow.
So when markets got quiet and he felt bored, it triggered this deeper fear of being a loser. And his impulsive trades were basically a way to do something, to feel productive, to push away that awful feeling. He was trading not to make money, but to avoid feeling like a failure.
That's fascinating. So how would exposure therapy work for him or for any trigger?
The idea is to intentionally expose yourself to the trigger, but, and this is crucial in a controlled state. So for the boredom trader, it meant deliberately making himself bored. Maybe imagining really boring scenarios, or even doing a mind-numbingly dull task during a session.
While staying calm.
Exactly. While actively practicing relaxation techniques, deep breathing, meditation, whatever works to keep his body and mind calm despite the trigger.
Why does that work?
Because you're teaching your brain something new. You're repeatedly pairing the trigger, boredom, with a non-anxious response. calmness. It gradually extinguishes the old fear reaction.
Like telling a joke over and over until it's not funny anymore.
That's a great analogy. You're stripping the trigger of its emotional power,
Right.
desensitizing yourself to it. He also mentions things like EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing.
Right, for trauma.
Yeah, where specific eye movements are used while recalling distressing memories. It seems to help the brain reprocess the memory, reducing its emotional charge. It shows these active techniques can really change brain patterns.
Okay, exposure sounds powerful for dealing with the triggers before they take hold. But what if you're already in that moment? Feeling impulsive, about to break your rules, is there something then?
Yes, there is. Technique number 2 is specifically for that. Reducing impulsive trading via heightened concentration.
Heightened concentration, how does that work?
The core idea is to basically jolt yourself out of that impulsive emotional state by forcing your brain into intense focus, like a mental workout.
Okay.
He describes an exercise derived from neuropsych tests. You might watch, say, a CNBC ticker tape numbers flashing by quickly. You take the last number shown, and you keep adding the next number that appears continuously in your head.
Wow, that sounds hard.
It is. It demands really high-level, sustained concentration. It forces your frontal lobes, your executive center, to take over.
And he actually measures this with
Yeah.
biofeedback.
Yeah, this is really cool. He uses a unit that measures forehead skin temperature. Turns out that temperature reflects blood flow in the brain. Yeah. When your frontal lobes are highly active, when you're concentrating, planning, in the zone, blood flow increases there, and your forehead temperature goes up.
And if you're emotional or reactive.
Blood flow shifts to lower brain structures, and the forehead temperature drops. So this little device gives you objective feedback on whether you're actually in that focused executive state.
That's amazing. So you get yourself into this super focused state using the exercise and the biofeedback. Then what?
Then, while you're in that highly concentrated state, you vividly imagine your desired behaviors. You mentally rehearse. You see yourself facing a tempting situation, maybe the urge to chase a trade, and then you clearly visualize yourself stopping, sticking to your plan, staying disciplined.
So you're programming the desired response while your executive brain is fully online.
Exactly. He even mentions using the biofeedback unit while he trades. If his temperature drops, meaning he's losing focus or getting emotional, he actually stops trading. Being in the zone becomes like an entry requirement for him.
That's serious commitment. Okay, so we've got exposure for triggers, concentration for impulsive moments. What about building positive patterns? Like confidence. Sometimes knowing you should be confident isn't enough.
Right. And that leads to the third technique, cultivating confidence and positive patterns. He calls this creating a positive trauma.
Positive trauma, that sounds contradictory.
It does, but think about it. A negative trauma leaves a powerful, lasting negative imprint. A positive trauma aims to create a powerful, lasting, positive imprint.
Oh.
The key is putting yourself into what he calls a distinctive state, something very different from your normal, everyday baseline state. Highly energized, maybe highly focused.
And he has a personal example for this too, right? The early morning workouts.
Yeah, his 4 a.m. ritual, it's not just casual exercise, it's intense.
Mm.
A rapid series of stretching, calisthenics, jogging, weights, isometrics, really getting himself physically pumped up, feeling energized, blood flowing, pushing himself.
Okay, so he gets into this really intense, energized state. Then what?
Then, while in that state, he intensively rehearses the patterns he wants to build. So when he wanted to lose weight, he'd vividly imagine and mentally talk through eating healthy, exercising consistently. Now, he might use it to rehearse executing his trading plan flawlessly.
So you're anchoring the desired behavior to that powerful, distinctive state.
Precisely. You're linking your intention, your plan, to that feeling of energy and focus. And the really cool part is how you use it later.
Oh.
During the day, if he feels tempted to slip back, maybe grab unhealthy food or make an impulsive trade, he can briefly reaccess that energized state, maybe just do 3 or 4 minutes of push-ups or jogging in place.
Like a mini recharge.
Exactly. It brings back that mindset, that anchored intention and planfulness. It helps him override the impulse. And he mentions he lost 35 pounds using this exact method.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, so let's recap the big strategies here. For changing emotional patterns, you can either
1. Intensively rehearse dealing with a trigger while you're in a very non-emotional, calm state. That's the exposure piece, desensitizing the trigger.
or 2.
2. Intensively rehearse the desired pattern or behavior while you're in a very distinctive, non-normal state, like highly energized or focused. That's the anchoring piece, building the new response.
And these aren't just for trading, right?
Not at all. He stresses that these techniques can tackle a huge range of performance issues. Test anxiety, public speaking fears, breaking personal habits.
And it doesn't have to take years.
That's his point. It's not necessarily about long-term talk therapy. It's about intensive, sustained repetition to forge new neural pathways. Like that joke analogy, repetition changes the brain's response.
Let's touch on some common questions people have about this, maybe things you've encountered, like the classic one. Why does paper trading feel so easy, but live trading is where people fall apart?
Yeah, that's a big one. And the answer goes right back to exposure. Paper trading just doesn't have the same emotional juice. There's no real money, no real risk activating those deep triggers.
So you haven't actually exposed yourself to the real emotional heat.
Exactly. You can practice the mechanics, but you haven't practiced managing the fear or greed that comes with real consequences.
Makes total sense.
Right.
What about that trigger of needing to be right, that feeling of validation? How do you handle that?
That's a tough one for many people. His advice is quite profound. You have to redefine what being right means.
Okay.
Being right isn't about whether a single trade made money. Being right is about following your plan, executing your process correctly. That's what you control.
Shift the definition of success.
Yes. And you can use exposure here too. Rehearse scenarios where you follow your plan, the trade doesn't work out, but you remain calm, emotionally neutral. You practice accepting that outcome without letting it define you or derail you, divested of its emotional sting.
Besides boredom, what other common triggers does he see often?
Fear is huge. Lots of fear-based triggers. Fear of losing money, obviously. Fear of missing out on a big move, FOMO. Even fear of losing a gain you already have, leading to taking profits too soon. And often, these fears tap into deeper issues of self-esteem. A loss doesn't just mean losing money. It means, I am a loser.
Oof. Yeah.
Which is why detaching your self-worth from trade outcomes through that kind of rehearsal we mentioned is so critical. He points out, good traders take lots of small losses. They just avoid the big, account-crippling ones.
Is missing an opportunity emotionally the same as taking a loss?
Often, yeah. From an emotional standpoint, they can feel remarkably similar. People get really stressed about the opportunity cost. Seeing a market run without you can feel just as risky or painful as being on the wrong side of it.
You still feel like you failed somehow.
Right. That loser feeling can pop up even if you didn't actually lose any money. The distress is real.
And how long does this reprogramming take? People talk about 21 days to form a habit.
Yeah, that's a common number.
Yeah.
But Dr. Steenbarger suggests that with intensive, focused repetition, you can potentially accelerate it quite a bit. Maybe even see shifts in a few focused sessions rather than weeks or months. He even mentioned, kind of intensely, staying up all night himself, doing exercises to speed up his own changes.
Whoa. Okay, back to the anchoring technique. Can the anchors be more subtle? Like, you probably can't bust out push-ups in the middle of the trading floor or an office meeting.
Probably not. But yes, absolutely. The anchor doesn't have to be physical exercise. If you consistently pair a more subtle cue, maybe a specific scent you carry, or touching a particular watch or a certain posture with that intense rehearsal in your distinctive state, that subtle cue can become a trigger for the desired state.
Through repetition.
Through repetition, yes. It just needs to be strongly linked during practice.
What about rehearsing something like road rage? Are you just trying not to be angry, or are you practicing a different reaction?
It's really both. The first goal is using exposure to disconnect the trigger, getting cut off from the intense anger response. Desensitize it.
Okay.
But then, yes, you can absolutely rehearse a more constructive response, maybe specific self-talk like, okay, deep breath, it's not personal, or visualizing yourself calmly letting it go, or even using it as a cue to practice a quick relaxation technique. You build a new pathway.
One last one. Loneliness. Trading can be isolating. Can that be a trigger?
Definitely. If being alone carries negative emotional baggage for someone, maybe links to feeling rejected, unpopular, whatever, then the isolation of trading could absolutely trigger those feelings.
And lead to coping behaviors.
Yeah, maybe things that interfere with trading, like spending too much time chatting online, constantly checking social media, anything to avoid that feeling of being alone, but which pulls focus away from the market. The underlying mechanism, trigger, state shift, coping behavior is often the same, just with different content.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big takeaway for someone facing their own challenges, their own loops?
I think the biggest shift is understanding that true change probably won't come from just gritting your teeth and fighting yourself.
Right. That internal battle.
It's more about First, understanding those triggers, what really sets you off,
Mm-hmm.
and then systematically working to either desensitize those triggers through exposure or building new positive responses anchored to specific states. It's a more strategic approach.
It sounds like it's about working with your psychology, not just against it.
Exactly. It highlights the incredible power of intentional, repeated practice. Not just physical practice, but mental and emotional practice to literally reshape your responses and build the self you actually want to be.
It's less about raw willpower, more about smart psychological strategy.
Precisely. Using these techniques to actively rewire those neural pathways.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Beyond the obvious stuff, what undigested emotional experiences, as Dr. Steenbarger might put it, could be quietly running the show in your daily decisions, leading to those moments of self-sabotage?
And on the flip side, what simple, subtle, but powerful anchors could you start building today? Anchors to reinforce your ideal self, ready to pull you back on track whenever you need them most.
Lots to think about there.
Definitely. We really encourage you to reflect on these ideas. Think about how you might start applying even one of these techniques. It really can transform those frustrating patterns into, well, into real growth.